I wasn't looking for giants. I want to be clear about that from the start. I was looking for railroad routes. Specifically, I was trying to understand why certain rail lines in the Ohio Valley took the paths they did in the 1870s and 1880s. It seemed like a simple question. There were economic reasons. There were geographic reasons. There were political reasons involving land grants and speculation. I had been reading through digitized newspapers from that period because I wanted to understand the practical arguments people made at the time for where to lay track and where to blast through hillsides and where to avoid sacred ground that might slow construction. That's all I wanted. A straightforward picture of how infrastructure decisions got made in post-Civil War America. And then, I found a brief notice in a Virginia paper. It was dated September 6, 1871, the Richmond Daily State Journal. The article was about an excavation near the Petersburg Railroad line. Workers had been digging. They found bones, human bones, and the notice described them in a way that made me stop scrolling. It said the teeth of the skeletons were as large as those of horses. That's the phrase that caught me. Not slightly larger than normal, not unusually developed, as large as those of horses. I assumed it was an exaggeration. 19th century journalism was prone to sensationalism. I know that. Everyone knows that. But the article wasn't written like a tall tale. It wasn't written like a curiosity piece meant to entertain. It was written like a construction update. It mentioned the railroad. It mentioned the location. It mentioned the bones as if they were an obstacle, a delay, something that had to be noted and moved past. The tone was bureaucratic. And that's what unsettled me. Because if you're making up a giant for entertainment, you don't bury the detail in a paragraph about railroad progress. You put it in the headline. You sensationalize it. You milk it. This article didn't do that. It mentioned the bones, gave the measurement comparison, and moved on. So I started looking for more. I didn't have to look far. Within a few hours, I had found over a dozen similar reports from the same region during the same decades. The Ohio River Valley, the 1870s through the 1890s. Newspapers from small towns and mid-sized cities reporting discoveries of skeletal remains during construction projects. Mound excavations, railroad cuts, foundation digging. And again, the same detail kept appearing. The bones were large, not slightly large, dramatically large. 7 feet, 8 feet, 9 feet. In one case, 9 feet 4 inches. The Muskingum County excavation was the one that made me sit back. It was reported in the Iron County Register sometime in the 1880s. A burial mound, 64 feet long, 35 feet wide. Inside, they found the skeleton of a woman measuring 8 feet, a child skeleton measuring 3.5 feet, and male skeletons measuring up to 9 feet 4 inches. That's not a typo. That's not a misprint. 9 feet 4 inches. Written out plainly. Reported in a regional newspaper as if it were a fact worth noting, and then forgetting. And I kept finding more. The Portsmouth News Herald. January 3, 1895. Railroad workers in Ohio uncovered a skeleton measuring 7 feet 4 inches. Again, the tone was matter-of-fact. Again, the article treated the discovery as news, not legend. Again, the bones appeared during infrastructure work, as if the ground itself kept offering up these remains every time someone dug deep enough. I started taking notes. I started building a timeline. I started mapping the locations. And the more I mapped, the more I noticed a pattern. These weren't random. These weren't scattered across the entire country. They were concentrated. The Ohio River Valley, the Great Lakes region, the upper Mississippi. The same geography that archaeologists already knew was dense with burial mounds. The same geography that had been home to what we now call the mound-building cultures. The Adena, the Hopewell, the Fort Ancient. Cultures that built earthworks on a scale that still puzzles people today. And I thought maybe that was the explanation. maybe these reports were errors. Maybe they were exaggerations, based on partially preserved remains that had been stretched or distorted by time and soil pressure. Maybe the journalists were bad at estimating measurements. Maybe the workers who found the bones were bad at estimating measurements. Maybe everyone was bad at estimating measurements, and these were just normal skeletons that got inflated in the telling. But then, I found the scholarly sources. The Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology published a report in 1894. It was called the Report on the Mound Explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology. It was written by Cyrus Thomas, and it documented hundreds of mound excavations across the eastern United States. Hundreds. This wasn't folklore. This wasn't newspaper sensationalism. This was a federal publication, a systematic archaeological survey. And buried in its pages were references to skeletal remains that didn't fit the normal range. I need to be careful here. The report doesn't shout about giants. It doesn't frame these findings as extraordinary. It simply records them. Measurements, locations, conditions of preservation. And some of those measurements are difficult to reconcile with what we consider the normal human range. Then I found Warren K. Moorehead. Moorehead was an archaeologist, a real one. He worked at the Peabody Museum. He conducted fieldwork across Ohio. In 1892, he published a book called Primitive Man in Ohio. And in that book, he described a skeleton he classified as a giant in size with a shoulder breadth of 19 inches. 19 inches across the shoulders. That's not a metaphor. That's a measurement taken by a professional archaeologist and published in a scholarly work. So now I had two categories of evidence. I had the newspaper reports, which were numerous and geographically consistent, but potentially unreliable. And I had the scholarly sources, which were fewer, but came with institutional credibility. And both categories pointed in the same direction. Something unusual was being found in those mounds. Something that didn't fit the expected range. Something that got recorded, published, and then somehow faded from the conversation. That's when I started asking a different question. Not were the bones real, but what happened to them? Because here's the thing. If dozens of newspapers reported giant skeletons in the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s, and if archaeologists like Moorehead documented similar findings in scholarly publications, and if the Smithsonian's own bureau conducted surveys of these mounds, then where are the bones now? Where are the photographs? Where are the museum displays? Where are the follow-up studies? I went looking for institutional records. I spent weeks in digital archives, university catalogs, museum collection databases, historical society inventories. And what I found wasn't a cover-up. I want to be clear about that. I didn't find evidence of a coordinated conspiracy to hide giant skeletons from the public. What I found was something more mundane, and in some ways, more troubling. I found bureaucratic indifference. I found entries in old catalogs where skeletal remains from mound excavations were labeled as medical anomaly and then filed away. I found collection records where bones were categorized as miscellaneous, or unverified, or decorative. I found notes that said no further analysis recommended. I found transfer records where materials moved from one institution to another and then stopped appearing in subsequent inventories. I found the kind of administrative drift that happens when something doesn't fit a category. Not suppression, just neglect, just the slow erosion of institutional attention. And I started to understand something about how knowledge gets lost. It doesn't take a conspiracy. It takes habit. It takes the pressure to publish findings that fit existing frameworks. It takes the career incentive to avoid topics that might make you look credulous. It takes the practical reality that museum storage is limited, and decisions have to be made about what to keep and what to deaccession. It takes the accumulated weight of small choices made by people who weren't trying to hide anything. They were just doing their jobs. They were just moving on to the next project. They were just filing things under labels that made sense at the time. But the pattern still bothered me, because if these bones were anomalies, why were there so many of them? And if they were fabrications, why did they appear in professional publications? And if they were errors, why did the errors all point in the same direction? Too many, too consistent, too geographically concentrated. The easy explanations kept leaving something behind. So I started looking at the built environment. This is where things got strange for me. Not strange in a sensational way. Strange in a quiet, nagging way. The kind of strange that accumulates. I started measuring things. Not skeletons. Buildings. Doorways. Staircases. I started looking at structures from the same period and region where these discoveries were reported. I started paying attention to proportions in spaces where grand design would have been pointless. Not mansions. Not public monuments. Utilitarian buildings. Barns. Mills. Early industrial structures. The kinds of places where form follows function, and nobody wastes money on oversized features for aesthetic reasons. And I kept finding scale problems. Door frames that seemed too tall. Step rises that seemed too high. Handle placements that seemed to assume a different reach. I measured a barn door in a photograph from an 1880s Ohio farmstead, and the proportions didn't make sense for a 5'8" farmer. The latch was too high. The hinge placement was too high. The whole frame was too high. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just enough to notice. Just enough to make me check another photograph, and another, and another. I want to be careful here. I'm not claiming that Ohio farmers in the 1880s were 9 feet tall. I'm not claiming that these barns were built for giants. I'm saying that when I started measuring and comparing, I found repeated scale inconsistencies that the standard explanations didn't fully address. Maybe the photographs are distorted. Maybe the reference points I'm using are wrong. Maybe there's a regional building tradition I don't understand. Maybe the answer is simple and I just haven't found it yet. But the inconsistencies kept piling up, and they kept appearing in functional spaces. Not decorative spaces, not ceremonial spaces. Spaces where people worked. Spaces where practicality should have dictated proportion. Then, I started looking at older maps. The mound builders didn't leave written records in the way we understand writing, but they left earthworks. And those earthworks were mapped. Surveyors in the 18th and early 19th centuries documented hundreds of mound sites across the Ohio Valley. They drew them. They measured them. They gave them names. And those maps still exist in archives. But here's what I noticed. The maps from 1820 don't match the maps from 1880. Not because the mounds moved, because the categories changed. Features that appeared prominently in early surveys became footnotes in later surveys. Names that appeared casually in early records became blurred or omitted in later records. Entire sites that were mapped and measured and described in detail simply stopped appearing. Not destroyed, not excavated, just administratively erased. And I kept finding this phrase in the early sources. It was ordinary to them. The surveyors who mapped these mounds in the 1810s and 1820s didn't treat them as mysteries. They treated them as landmarks. They used them for navigation. They built roads around them. They named them and noted them and moved on. The mounds were part of the landscape. The burials inside them were known. The unusual bones were known. It was all ordinary to them. It only became strange to us later, when the categories tightened, when the framework solidified, when the range of acceptable human variation narrowed. What had been ordinary became anomalous. What had been noted became footnoted. What had been mapped became unmapped. I'm not saying this was deliberate. I'm saying it was structural. The way we organize knowledge determines what we can see. And somewhere between 1820 and 1880, the organizational structure shifted. The frame changed. And things that had been visible became invisible. Then, I went back to the newspaper archives, not looking for giant skeletons this time, looking for the pattern of coverage. And I found something that made the hair on my arms stand up. The reports start appearing in the 1860s. They accelerate through the 1870s and 1880s. They peak in the 1890s. And then they stop, not gradually, abruptly. By 1900, the newspapers aren't reporting giant skeletons anymore. The mound excavations continue. The construction projects continue. The digging continues. But the bones stop making news. Why? I can think of several explanations. Maybe the discoveries stopped happening. Maybe the newspapers lost interest. Maybe the scientific establishment signaled that such reports were embarrassing, and editors took the hint. Maybe the bones were still being found, but no one thought they were worth mentioning. Maybe the whole phenomenon was a fad that burned itself out. But none of those explanations feel complete. Because the mounds are still there. The bones should still be there. The construction projects continued for decades. If the discoveries were real, they should have continued. If they were fabrications, someone should have exposed the pattern. If they were errors, the errors should have persisted at the same rate. Instead, the reports just stop, like someone closed a door. And that's when I started looking for the physical traces, not bones, objects, artifacts, things that might have been made by hands larger than mine, things that might have been used by bodies scaled differently than mine. I found them in the same archives where I found everything else, not displayed, not highlighted, cataloged, filed, labeled. Oversized tools, stone implements with grip dimensions that seem wrong for a normal human hand, axes that seem too heavy for efficient use unless you assume a different leverage, hammers with handle lengths that don't match the ergonomics I understand, furniture pieces from early excavations with seat heights that seem too tall, fittings and hardware with proportions that seem scaled up, and always the same labels: decorative, ceremonial, ritual object, status symbol. Maybe those labels are correct. Maybe these objects were made large on purpose for reasons that had nothing to do with the size of the people who made them. Cultures do that. Cultures make oversized objects for symbolic reasons. I know that. But the labels started to feel like a reflex, a way of categorizing things that don't fit without having to explain why they don't fit. Because here's what bothered me. The objects showed wear. They showed use patterns. The edges were dulled the way edges get dulled from repeated contact. The handles were smooth, the way handles get smooth from repeated gripping. The surfaces showed the kind of abrasion that comes from function, not display. Decorative objects don't wear like that. Ceremonial objects don't wear like that. Objects that are used wear like that. So I kept asking, if these tools were used, who used them? If these dimensions were functional, whose function did they serve? If these proportions were practical, whose practice did they reflect? And I kept running into the same wall. The bones are gone. The records are fragmented. The categories have shifted. The institutional memory has faded. The questions that seem obvious now weren't asked when answers might have been possible. Let me try to put this together. Suppose for a moment that the newspaper reports were accurate. Suppose the archaeological publications were accurate. Suppose the surveyors and the farmers, and the railroad workers and the museum curators were all describing something real. What would that mean? It would mean that the burial mounds of the Ohio Valley contained the remains of people who were significantly larger than the modern human. Average. Not slightly larger. Significantly larger. 7 feet, 8 feet, 9 feet. It would mean that a population of unusually large people lived in this region centuries or millennia ago. It would mean that their bones were encountered routinely during the 19th century. It would mean that those bones were recorded, documented, collected, and then gradually lost to institutional drift. It would reframe everything. The scale problems in the built environment would make sense. The oversized tools would make sense. The proportions of the mounds themselves would make sense. The whole pattern would shift from mysterious to functional. Not ceremonial excess, not symbolic inflation, just people building things that fit their bodies. But I have to test this against the counter-explanations. I have to be honest about what I don't know. Counter-explanation 1. The newspaper reports were hoaxes or exaggerations. 19th century journalism was unreliable. Editors printed sensational claims to sell papers. The giant skeleton stories were entertainment, not news. This explanation handles some of the evidence. It explains why the newspaper reports might be wrong, but it doesn't explain the scholarly sources. It doesn't explain Cyrus Thomas at the Smithsonian. It doesn't explain Warren Moorhead at the Peabody Museum. It doesn't explain why professional archaeologists would publish measurements that were fabricated by newspapers. Unless the archaeologists were also exaggerating. Unless the whole field was complicit in a collective fiction. And that starts to require a conspiracy theory of its own. Counter-explanation 2. The measurements were errors. People in the 19th century were bad at measuring. They didn't have standardized methods. They estimated rather than calculated. The bones were normal-sized and got inflated in the reporting. This explanation handles some of the evidence too. Measurement error is real. Estimation bias is real. But it doesn't explain why the errors were all in the same direction. If people were just bad at measuring, you'd expect some underestimates and some overestimates. You'd expect variation. Instead, the errors are consistent, always larger, always in the same geographic region, always associated with the same type of site. That's not random error. That's a pattern. Counter-explanation 3. The bones were real, but they weren't human. They were misidentified animal remains. Or they were pathological specimens. Or they were composites assembled from multiple individuals. This explanation handles some of the evidence too. Misidentification happens. Pathological gigantism exists. Bones can get mixed up in archaeological contexts, but it doesn't explain the descriptions. The reports don't describe animal bones. They describe human bones, skulls, jaws, limbs, arranged in burial positions, associated with human artifacts, in mounds that everyone agrees were built by human cultures. If these were animal bones or pathological specimens, someone should have noticed. Someone with expertise, someone like Moorehead. And instead of noting the anomaly, they recorded the measurements and moved on. None of the counter-explanations are complete. They all leave something unexplained. They all require me to assume that multiple independent sources were wrong in the same way, at the same time about the same thing in the same place. Maybe they were. Maybe this whole pattern is an artifact of 19th century credulity and 20th century indifference. Maybe I'm seeing connections that aren't there. Maybe I'm falling into the trap of wanting there to be a mystery. But the questions won't stop. Why did the reports cluster so tightly in one region? Why did they appear in professional publications as well as newspapers? Why did the coverage stop so abruptly? Why are the bones missing from collections that should have them? Why do the catalog labels feel like deflections rather than explanations? Why do the oversized artifacts show functional wear? Why do the built environment proportions keep coming up wrong? Why does everything point in the same direction? I don't have answers. I only have accumulation. Evidence that piles up without resolving. Patterns that repeat without confirming. Questions that lead to more questions. And I keep coming back to that phrase. It was ordinary to them. The surveyors in 1820 didn't think they were documenting a mystery. They thought they were documenting a landscape. The newspaper reporters in 1870 didn't think they were reporting a sensation. They thought they were reporting construction delays. The archaeologists in 1890 didn't think they were publishing extraordinary claims. They thought they were publishing measurements. It only became strange later, when the frame changed, when the categories tightened, when we decided what was possible and what wasn't, when we drew the boundaries of acceptable human variation and pushed everything else into the margins. Maybe the boundaries are correct. Maybe human variation really does have limits and the 19th century sources were simply wrong. Maybe the bones were never as large as reported. Maybe the tools were never as functional as they seemed. Maybe the built environment proportions have explanations I haven't found yet. But maybe the boundaries are assumptions. Maybe the frame is the problem. Maybe we've organized our knowledge in a way that makes certain things invisible. Not through conspiracy, through habit, through the accumulated weight of small decisions, through the career incentives that reward conformity and penalize curiosity. I think about the bones in that Muskingum County mound, 9 feet 4 inches. I think about the railroad workers in Portsmouth who found the 7-foot 4-inch skeleton and then went back to laying track. I think about Cyrus Thomas compiling his report for the Smithsonian and noting the measurements without comment. I think about Warren Moorehead examining that skeleton with a 19-inch shoulder breadth and calling it a giant in size and then moving on to his next excavation. They all saw something. They all recorded it. They all treated it as ordinary. And then we forgot. Not deliberately, structurally. The way knowledge forgets itself when the categories shift. The way evidence disappears when the labels change. The way the past becomes invisible when the present decides what it wants to see. I'm left with questions I can't answer. What happened to the bones from the Muskingum County excavation? Where are they now? Who has them? Who had them? When did they stop being tracked? Why did they stop being tracked? What happened to all the bones from all the excavations? The dozens of newspaper reports, the scholarly publications, the museum acquisitions, hundreds of mounds excavated over decades, hundreds of unusual remains documented. Where did they all go? And here's the question that keeps me up at night. If someone wanted to know the truth, if someone with resources and access and institutional authority wanted to answer these questions definitively, could they? Is the evidence still there to be found? Are the bones still in some collection somewhere, mislabeled and forgotten? Are the records still in some archive somewhere, misfiled and overlooked? Or has the window closed? Has the structural forgetting become permanent? I don't know. I started this looking for railroad routes. I ended up looking at something I can't fully see. A shape in the archives. A pattern in the silence. An accumulation of ordinary details that add up to something extraordinary. Or to nothing at all. The mounds are still there. You can visit them. The Serpent Mound. The Newark Earthworks. The Hopewell sites. They're protected now. Preserved. Interpreted through visitor centers and informational plaques. And the plaques will tell you about the cultures that built them. The Adena, the Hopewell, the Fort Ancient. Sophisticated societies with complex beliefs and impressive engineering. But the plaques won't mention the bones. They won't mention the newspaper reports or the archaeological publications or the 9-foot 4-inch skeleton or the 19-inch shoulder breadth. They won't mention the pattern that appeared in the 1870s and disappeared in the 1900s. They won't mention the institutional drift or the catalog labels or the missing collections, because those details don't fit the frame. And what doesn't fit the frame becomes invisible, ordinary to them, strange to us, and then forgotten by everyone. I keep thinking about what it would mean if I'm right. Not completely right, just partially right, just enough for the questions to matter. It would mean that the American landscape holds secrets we've taught ourselves not to see. It would mean that the people who lived here before us were more varied than our textbooks allow. It would mean that the evidence was there all along, recorded and documented and published, waiting for someone to take it seriously again. It would mean that history isn't fixed, that knowledge isn't permanent, that what we think we know is shaped by what we're willing to consider. Or maybe it would mean nothing. Maybe this is all a dead end. Maybe the newspaper reports were hoaxes. Maybe the scholarly sources were errors. Maybe the patterns I see are artifacts of my own searching. Maybe I've spent months chasing shadows that were never there. But even then, even if I'm completely wrong, the questions remain. Who were the mound builders? How did they live? What did they look like? How much have we lost? How much have we chosen to forget? And what else is buried in the archives, waiting for someone to ask the right questions? I started with railroad routes. I ended somewhere I didn't expect. And I don't think I'm done yet. There's a phrase that keeps appearing in the oldest surveys. Before the categories tightened. Before the frame settled. When the mounds were still ordinary and the bones were still news. The phrase appears in surveyors' notes, and travelers' accounts and early archaeological reports. It appears without emphasis, without sensationalism, without apparent awareness that it might matter. The ancient race of giants. They didn't mean it metaphorically. They meant it descriptively. They were describing what they found. Bones that seemed too large. Mounds that seemed too grand. A landscape that seemed to remember people who had been forgotten. It was ordinary to them. And maybe that's what bothers me most. Not that the bones are missing. Not that the records are fragmentary. Not that the institutions have moved on. What bothers me is how quickly something can go from ordinary to impossible. How quickly evidence can become anomaly. How quickly knowledge can become ignorance. It took less than a century, between 1820 and 1900. Less than 100 years for something that surveyors noted casually to become something that professionals avoid discussing. Less than 100 years for documented measurements to become embarrassing curiosities. Less than 100 years for the frame to shift so completely that the old sources read like fiction. What else has shifted? What else have we forgotten? What else sits in archives right now, labeled and filed, and waiting for the categories to change again? I don't know. But I'm going to keep looking, because here's the thing about patterns. Once you see one, you start seeing others. Once you notice the shape of institutional silence, you notice it everywhere. Once you understand how knowledge forgets itself, you understand that forgetting is the default. Remembering takes effort. Remembering takes attention. Remembering takes someone willing to ask questions that don't fit the frame. So here are my questions, the ones I can't let go of. If the bones existed, where are they now? If the measurements were real, why did we stop believing them? If the evidence was ordinary to them, why is it impossible to us? And if there really were people in the Ohio Valley who stood 9 feet tall, what else have we decided not to see? The mounds are still there. The questions are still there. The silence is still there. I'm not done yet.